A woman can survive being unloved, but being forgotten by the man she quietly saved is a colder death. The thought came to Audrey Bellamy at the exact moment Duke Everett Hawthorne looked directly at her, and could not remember her name. Hawthorne House stood above the black Atlantic like a judgment carved from stone, its tall windows trembling beneath the December wind, its chandeliers burning with enough candlelight to make every silver fork, crystal glass, and pearl-buttoned glove appear almost holy. Beyond the glass, waves struck the main cliffs with a sound like distant thunder, and the lighthouse 3 miles down the coast opened and closed its pale eye through the fog. Inside, the winter charity supper had reached its most elegant hour. Ladies in satin bent their heads behind fans. Gentlemen warmed brandy between gloved fingers. Servants moved like shadows over polished dark wood. And at the head of the long dining room, Duke Everett Hawthorne performed the duty expected of him with flawless severity. He was 36, tall, fair-skinned, dark-haired, and composed in the way only a man with a ruined heart could be composed. His black evening coat sat perfectly across his shoulders. His expression revealed nothing. Not fatigue. Not grief. Not even boredom. Audrey stood near the sideboard with a leather folio pressed lightly to her chest, the final guest list memorized, the seating corrections completed, the donation pledges folded in exact order. She had worked for 3 nights to prevent the evening from collapsing into embarrassment. She had rewritten invitations after the storm delayed 3 families from Boston. She had discovered that the oyster shipment from Portland had spoiled and arranged for a safer supper before anyone of rank could be offended. She had placed Lady Maribel Stone far enough from the governor's widow to avoid a quarrel, close enough to Everett to please his aunt, and not so close that the county could call it an announcement. No one noticed. That was the gift Audrey had perfected. She made disasters disappear before powerful people had to acknowledge them. Then Count Hollis, visiting from New York, lifted his glass and smiled toward her. Your Grace, the young lady who prepared the subscription ledgers deserves a word of praise. I confess I have never seen figures arranged with such clarity. What is her name? It was a simple question. A merciful question, almost. Everett turned. His gray eyes found Audrey across the gold-lit room. For one fragile second, she felt the full weight of being seen by him. Her breath caught quietly beneath the collar of her plain ivory gown. 3 years, she thought. 3 winters in this house. 3 years of ink-stained fingers, late lamps, sealed letters, rescued accounts, and silent mornings when she placed his correspondence beside his untouched coffee before he entered the study. Surely a name could survive that much usefulness. Everett's gaze remained on her face. His brow moved by the smallest measure. Not confusion enough for others to pity. Just enough for Audrey to understand. He did not know. Or worse, he could not reach for it quickly enough to save her dignity. Miss Carter has indeed been helpful, he said, his voice calm, rich, and careless. A spoon touched porcelain somewhere down the table. Someone inhaled too sharply. Lady Maribel Stone lowered her fan just enough to reveal the faint curve of amusement at her mouth. How very diligent Miss Carter must be, she murmured. Audrey felt the name strike her and pass through without leaving blood. Carter. That was the laundry maid who had left in April. A kind girl. A forgettable girl. Perhaps all women beneath a certain station became one another when viewed from such height. The folio edge pressed into Audrey's palm. The room waited. Not kindly. Society did not always need cruelty to wound. Sometimes curiosity was enough. Audrey lifted her chin, the candlelight soft along her pale cheek, and smiled. Not brightly. Not foolishly. A small, trained smile, gentle enough to forgive him in public and quiet enough to condemn him in private. Of course, Your Grace, she said. Her voice did not break. That was her final service to him. She gave him the mercy of not showing the room what he had done. Everett nodded once, already turning back to Count Hollis, already letting the moment sink beneath the polished surface of the evening. Conversation resumed with delicate haste. Forks moved again. Wine was poured. A violin began in the adjoining music room, thin and sweet beneath the storm. Audrey stepped backward into the shadow beside the velvet drapes, where the heat from the hearth could not quite reach. Her smile remained until no one was watching. Then it vanished. In the reflection of the dark window, she saw herself as the house must have seen her for years, fair-skinned, brown-haired, modestly dressed, useful, quiet, and unnamed. She looked not ruined, not dramatic, not even surprised. Only finished. When the first waltz began and the guests drifted toward the ballroom, Audrey crossed the corridor alone. Her footsteps made no sound on the runner she had ordered replaced last fall after Everett nearly tripped on the torn edge. The hallway smelled of beeswax, salt air, and winter roses. Portraits of Hawthorne ancestors watched her pass with cold, inherited eyes. At the library door she stopped. From the ribbon at her throat, she unclasped the small brass key she had worn for 3 years. It was warm from her skin. Beyond the door waited the ledgers, the sealed contracts, the letters written in her careful hand, the life she had mistaken for purpose because it allowed her to stand near him. Audrey placed her palm flat against the carved oak and listened to the distant music. He had forgotten her name in a room full of strangers. By morning, she would make certain he remembered her absence. Then Audrey Bellamy closed her fingers around the key, turned away from the light, and walked toward the narrow servants' stair that led to her cold little room beneath the eaves. The narrow servants' stair carried Audrey upward through the bones of Hawthorne House, away from the music, away from the candlelit faces, away from the careless voice that had turned 3 years of loyalty into a stranger's name. The higher she climbed, the colder the air became, until the warmth of the dining room felt less like a memory than a dream someone else had been allowed to live. Her room waited beneath the eastern eaves, small and slanted, with a ceiling low enough to make tall people bow and a window that looked over the iron-gray Atlantic. Frost had gathered along the inside of the glass in delicate white veins. The basin water on her washstand was nearly frozen. A single lamp burned low beside the bed, throwing a thin circle of gold across the floorboards, her trunk, and the stack of account papers she had meant to finish before dawn. Audrey stood in the doorway without moving. This had been her kingdom. 12 feet by 10 feet, a narrow bed, 2 hooks for dresses, a cracked mirror, and a shelf of books her father had once repaired with paste and patience. Here, she had learned the shape of silence. Here, she had taught herself not to listen for footsteps that would never come. 3 years earlier, she had arrived at Hawthorne House in a borrowed brown coat, with $7 in her purse and a letter of recommendation folded so often that the paper had weakened at the creases. Her father, Thomas Bellamy, had spent his life teaching children in a small coastal schoolhouse near Camden, Maine, and had left behind nothing but debts, books, and a daughter who could calculate faster than most clerks and remember every page she had ever read. Everett Hawthorne had not interviewed her himself. He had stood by the study window while his steward explained that Miss Bellamy could copy ledgers, translate French correspondence, and organize the late Duchess's old library catalogue. Everett had glanced at her once, long enough to judge that she was plainly dressed, pale from grief, and unlikely to disturb the order of the house. "Quiet, is she?" he had asked. "Yes, Your Grace," the steward replied. "Then let her try." That was all. Not welcome. Not sympathy. Not even curiosity. Yet Audrey had been grateful. Gratitude, she later learned, could become a soft chain if worn too long. At first, her work had been simple. She copied letters in the library while rain moved across the windows and Everett's boots sounded occasionally in the hall. She sorted invoices, labeled estate maps, and corrected columns of figures no one else had noticed were wrong. Within 6 months, she understood Hawthorne House better than men who had been paid to manage it for 20 years. She discovered that the coal merchant charged for deliveries never made. She found duplicate payments hidden in the kitchen accounts. She rewrote the harbor lease after noticing a clause that would have cost Everett nearly $8,000 over 5 years. When she placed the corrected document on his desk, he signed it without looking up. "Efficient," he said. The word warmed her for a week, foolishly, shamefully, because she had so little else. It was not only the ledgers. When Mrs. Alder, the old housekeeper, grew ill, Audrey arranged a warmer room for her near the kitchen and paid for medicine from her own wages before asking permission. When the stable boy's mother died in Portland, Audrey wrote the letter requesting leave because the boy's hands shook too badly to hold a pen. When a storm shattered the south greenhouse, she moved the rare winter roses herself, carrying clay pots through sleet until her fingers ached. Those roses bloomed on Everett's dining table the next morning. He praised the gardener. Audrey said nothing. Silence became her habit, then her armor, then the language by which she survived. She learned the hour Everett took coffee, the day's grief made him refuse breakfast, the particular black ink he preferred for legal correspondence, and the way he paused outside the locked west wing every Friday evening but never opened the door. She knew the house held a dead woman's name more carefully than it held her living one. Still, she stayed. Not because she believed he loved her. Audrey was not that naive. She stayed because usefulness can imitate belonging in the dark. Now, in her little room under the eaves, she removed the brass key from her palm and set it on the desk. Her skin bore its shape. Downstairs, the waltz continued, muted by distance until it sounded like the sea inside a shell. Audrey opened her trunk. One gray traveling dress. One clean collar. Her father's Bible. 3 books. A packet of wages tied in cotton string. She packed without haste and without tears. Tears would have suggested surprise, and there was none left in her. On the desk, beside the unfinished accounts, lay the seating chart for tomorrow's luncheon. At the top, in her careful hand, she had written every guest's name correctly. Every title. Every preference. Every fragile vanity protected. She touched the page once, then turned it over. On the blank side she began her final note. Audrey wrote the first sentence and then stopped, not because the words failed her, but because too many arrived at once. The lamp trembled in the draught from the window, and its small flame turned the brass key into a dull coin of light on the desk. Below her, Hawthorne House continued its performance of warmth. Music traveled through the walls, softened by distance, while laughter rose and faded like birds circling a roof they would never enter. She dipped the pen again. "Your Grace," she wrote, and the formality steadied her hand. It was strange how easily grief could become tidy when placed on paper. She did not write that she had loved him in the only way a woman in her position could love a man like Everett Hawthorne, without claim, without hope, without daring to imagine that the world would ever permit such a feeling to stand in daylight. She did not write that she had learned his house as others learned scripture, that she knew which floorboard outside his study complained in damp weather, which chair he chose when his memories were worst, which unopened letters from his aunt required immediate answers and which could be left until morning. She did not write that every Friday, when the West Wing clock chimed 8, she had seen him pass the library with the look of a man walking toward a grave. That truth belonged to him. Perhaps it always had. The West Wing had been locked since before Audrey came to Hawthorne House, yet its presence ruled the mansion more completely than any living mistress could have done. It began at the end of the portrait corridor, behind double doors of dark walnut carved with ivy and sea birds, their handles wrapped in old black ribbon that no servant dared remove. Beyond them lay the rooms once prepared for Vivian Ellery, Everett's intended bride, the golden girl whose name survived in whispers, in covered portraits, in the careful sadness of older servants, and in the way Everett's face emptied whenever someone spoke of summer on the cliffs. Audrey had learned the story in fragments, never because anyone told it kindly. A parlor maid mentioned the unopened wedding china. The gardener spoke of roses ordered and never used. Mrs. Alder, during one feverish night when Audrey sat beside her with a cup of broth, had murmured that Miss Ellery had been beautiful enough to make the whole county forgive her pride. She had died in a carriage accident on Shore Road during a stormy evening in June, less than 2 weeks before the wedding. No one described the accident in detail. No one needed to. The house had preserved the result in every drawn curtain and unused room. After Vivian's death, Everett dismissed half the guests, cancelled the wedding, closed the ballroom for a year, and returned from the funeral with a stillness so complete that people began to praise it as strength. But Audrey had never mistaken numbness for strength. She had seen what lived beneath it. Once, during her second winter at Hawthorne House, she had gone downstairs near midnight to retrieve a Boston shipping ledger and found Everett standing before the west wing doors in his shirt sleeves, one hand resting on the ribbon handle. Snow tapped the windows behind him. His face looked younger in the darkness, almost unguarded, with sorrow stripped of title and command. Audrey should have retreated. Instead, one floorboard betrayed her. Everett turned so sharply that the candlestick in his hand guttered. For a breath, they simply looked at one another across the dim corridor. "You are awake late, Miss Bellamy," he said. He knew her name then. Quietly. Correctly. The memory pierced her now more sharply than his mistake at dinner, because it proved he had possessed the name once and let it fall from his care. That night she had curtsied and answered, "The harbor accounts required correction, Your Grace." He glanced toward the locked doors, then away. "Some rooms should remain closed." "Yes, Your Grace." "And some names should not be spoken." She had not asked which name he meant. Vivian's, perhaps. Or his own, the one belonging to the man he had been before grief turned him into marble. After that, Audrey understood him better than she wanted to. Everett Hawthorne did not forget because he lacked memory. He forgot because remembering frightened him. To remember a person was to admit they had entered the house of his heart. To speak a name was to open a door. And he had spent years locking doors. The tragedy was not that he had protected himself from love. The tragedy was that Audrey had been standing outside those locked rooms, holding the household together, while he mistook her patience for furniture and her loyalty for air. Her pen moved again. She wrote no accusation. Accusations could be debated. Absence could not. "I have completed the winter accounts through the end of December. The harbor lease requires your signature before Friday. Mrs. Alder's medicine is paid until spring. The library key is enclosed." She paused, then added the sentence that made her hand grow cold. "I smiled because I knew you would forget the wound, so I left before you could forget me entirely." Audrey sanded the ink, folded the note once, and placed the brass key atop it. Downstairs, the music ended to polite applause. Above the sea, the lighthouse opened its pale eye through the fog, and in its brief light Audrey saw the room not as a refuge, but as a place she had already survived. She took up her trunk, blew out the lamp, and let the darkness receive her without a sound. By the time Audrey reached the lower corridor, the charity supper had softened into that delicate hour when guests no longer remembered they were guests. The dining room doors stood open, spilling candlelight across the polished floor in long golden rectangles, while beyond them laughter rose over the clink of glass and the polite scrape of chairs. Audrey paused in the shadow near the servants' passage, her trunk hidden behind the half-wall beside her. She had meant to pass unseen. She had meant to leave cleanly, like a page turned without sound. Then Lady Maribel Stone spoke her false name again. "Miss Carter," she called, her voice bright enough to seem innocent and sharp enough to cut. Audrey turned. Maribel stood near the side table in pale blue silk, one hand resting lightly on the back of Everett's chair as though the place beside him already belonged to her. Her fair hair had been arranged with pearls, each one glowing in the candlelight like a small, perfect moon. Several guests looked over, drawn not by kindness but by the promise of embarrassment. Everett was speaking to Count Hollis, and did not immediately glance up. That, more than Maribel's smile, made Audrey's chest tighten. "Yes, Lady Maribel?" Audrey asked. Her voice remained soft. She had learned long ago that a quiet woman frightened the cruel more than a trembling one, because silence offered them no proof of victory. Maribel lifted a folded program from the table. "You have seated Mrs. Winthrop beside Mr. Lansing tomorrow morning. Surely that cannot be correct. They quarreled over the hospital board last spring." Audrey crossed the room with measured steps and accepted the program. Her fingers were cold, but they did not shake. "Mrs. Winthrop wrote this afternoon to request precisely that arrangement. She hopes to settle the matter before the trustees arrive from Boston." A few brows rose. Maribel's smile thinned. "How industrious of you to know the private intentions of your betters. The words were soft enough to pass as wit. The room understood them correctly. Audrey bowed her head just enough to satisfy rank, not enough to surrender dignity. "It is my duty to prevent discomfort where I can." "And yet," Maribel said, turning slightly so that Everett might hear, "you allowed His Grace discomfort tonight by making him search for your name. Perhaps a girl in your position should wear a little card." Someone laughed behind a fan. Not loudly. Worse, discreetly. Audrey felt the sound move through her like a draft beneath a locked door. Everett finally looked up. His eyes rested first on Maribel, then on Audrey, then on the program in her hand. For one impossible moment she waited for him to correct the name. Not defend her. Not favor her. Only correct what was false. He did not. His face remained composed, almost weary, as if this small cruelty belonged to the harmless machinery of society and not to the center of a human heart. "Lady Maribel," he said at last, "I am certain Miss Bellamy has arranged matters efficiently." The true name entered the room too late to save anything. Audrey heard it clearly. So did Maribel. So did everyone who had watched him forget it less than an hour before. A correction offered only after humiliation was not protection. It was housekeeping. Maribel gave a small laugh. "Miss Bellamy, then. Forgive me. The staff changes so often in grand houses that one can hardly be expected to remember every useful person." "Of course," Audrey said. "No forgiveness is necessary." It was the perfect answer. Calm. Polite. Devastating only to herself. Everett's gaze sharpened at something in her tone, but he said nothing more. He had always trusted silence to settle what he did not wish to touch. Audrey set the program on the table, exactly aligned with the silver edge. "Mrs. Alder has the revised seating list. The morning correspondence is prepared in the library. The harbor lease is marked for your signature." Everett frowned slightly. "Tonight? It seemed best not to leave anything unfinished, Your Grace." The words hung between them, ordinary enough for the room, final enough for her. His attention shifted, almost unwillingly, to her gown, then to the faint dampness at the hem where snow from the servant's stair had touched it. "You look pale," he said. A small thing. A crumb of concern. Once it might have fed her for days. Now it only made the emptiness clearer. "It is only the cold," Audrey replied. "Then warm yourself before you continue working." "Yes, Your Grace." Maribel watched with bright, satisfied eyes. "Such devotion. Hawthorne House is fortunate in its servants." Audrey smiled again, and this time the effort felt like closing a door with both hands. She curtsied to the table, to the guests, to the man who had remembered her name only after someone else used it as a toy. Then she withdrew through the candlelight without haste. No one stopped her. Behind her, the conversation mended itself. The violin began another waltz. The house returned to its elegant breathing. In the passage, Audrey took up her trunk. It was heavier than before, though she had packed almost nothing. At the end of the corridor, the side door waited beneath an iron lamp, its glass clouded with frost. She opened it carefully. The night entered at once, carrying salt, snow, and the wild voice of the Atlantic. Audrey stepped outside onto the stone path. Hawthorne House rose behind her, bright in every window except the small dark square beneath the eastern eaves. She looked back only once. Not at the dining room. Not at the ballroom. At the library window, where the lamp still burned for a man who would soon reach for a key that was no longer around her neck. Then Audrey Bellamy walked down the cliff road toward the village station, her plain cloak pulled tight, her name finally safe in the only place he could no longer misplace it, with herself. The road from Hawthorne House to the village station was barely 2 miles, yet to Audrey it felt like a crossing between one life and the next. Snow had begun again, not in a storm, but in soft, deliberate flakes that settled on her bonnet, her shoulders, and the old leather trunk she carried with both hands. The Atlantic moved below the cliffs in restless darkness, its waves hidden but never silent, and the lighthouse turned its pale beam across the road every half-minute as if the coast itself were counting her departure. She walked carefully. Her boots were thin, her breath visible, her fingers stiff around the trunk handle, but she did not turn back again. Behind her, Hawthorne House glowed above the rocks like a mansion built to keep sorrow warm. Its windows were bright with music and privilege. Its roof cut the white sky cleanly. For 3 years, Audrey had believed herself part of its hidden machinery, a small wheel turning in the dark so that others might dance without interruption. Now, with each step, she understood the cruelty of that belief. A machine could be used. A woman should be known. At the bend near the old carriage shed, she stopped beneath a bare elm tree to rest her aching hands. From there, the house was still visible, though smaller now, its grand entrance blurred by falling snow. She wondered when Everett would notice. Perhaps when he reached for the revised guest list. Perhaps when he entered the library after midnight, expecting to find the fire lit and the harbor lease waiting beside his preferred black pen. Perhaps not until morning, when Mrs. Alder found the brass key and the folded note in the room beneath the eaves. Audrey wished she did not care which it would be. Caring had been the root of all her foolishness. She had cared whether his coffee cooled before he drank it. She had cared whether the west corridor remained too dark in winter. She had cared whether his gloves were laid near the study hearth after rain, whether the trustees from Boston found the accounts impressive, whether the old servants whispered that His Grace looked less tired when Miss Bellamy had arranged the day. She had cared so quietly that no one thought to call it devotion. They called it efficiency. She lifted the trunk again and continued down the hill. The village station was no more than a wooden platform, a small ticket office, and a pot-bellied stove that smoked when the wind came from the east. By the time Audrey arrived, the last evening train to Boston had already taken on coal and passengers. Yellow light shone from its windows. Steam drifted over the tracks, turning the snow to silver mist. A station clerk in a wool cap looked up as she stepped inside. "Evening, miss. You near missed it. 1 ticket to Boston, please," Audrey said. Her voice sounded calm to her own ears, almost belonging to someone older. "One way?" The question touched something tender. One way meant no room under the eaves. No library key against her throat. No quiet chair near Everett's desk. No name waiting to be forgotten in another crowded room. "Yes," she said. "One way." The clerk counted her coins, printed the ticket, and slid it across the counter. "Train leaves in 6 minutes." Audrey thanked him and moved to the platform. The cold there was sharper, filled with iron, smoke, and the smell of wet timber. She stood among strangers, a mother with 2 sleepy children, a traveling salesman guarding a sample case, an elderly couple wrapped in matching gray scarves. No one knew who she was. No one expected her to remember a seating chart, rescue a contract, or soften the consequences of a powerful man's grief. The anonymity should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like air. When the train whistle sounded, Audrey glanced once toward the dark road behind her. No carriage lamps appeared. No horse hooves struck the snow. No tall figure came down from Hawthorne House with regret in his face and her name on his lips. She had known he would not. Still, some small, wounded part of her had listened. She hated that part gently, the way one might pity a bird that kept flying toward a closed window. She boarded the train and found a seat beside the frosted glass. As the wheels shuddered beneath her, she placed her trunk at her feet and drew her father's small Bible into her lap, not to read, but to hold something that had belonged to a person who had never once forgotten what to call her. The train lurched forward. The station slipped away. The village lights thinned behind the veil of snow. Far above the coast, Hawthorne House remained bright for another minute, then another, until the curve of the tracks took it from view. Audrey did not cry then. Tears would come later, perhaps in a rented room in Boston, perhaps over a cup of weak tea when no one was watching. For now, she sat very straight, her pale face reflected in the dark window, and let the distance gather between herself and the man who had remembered too late to matter. By the time Everett Hawthorne asked for the library key, Audrey Bellamy was already 30 miles away. Everett Hawthorne asked for the library key at 17 minutes past midnight, and that was the first moment the house failed to obey him. The charity guests had gone to their rooms or departed through the snow beneath black umbrellas. The musicians had packed their instruments. The dining room candles had burned low, leaving the silver dull and the white roses browned at the edges. Hawthorne House, usually exact even in its silence, seemed strangely unsettled, as though some hidden clock inside its walls had stopped. Everett stood outside the library with one hand extended, waiting while Mr. Vale, the butler, searched his ring of keys with increasing discomfort. "The library key, Your Grace," Everett said again. Mr. Vale bowed his head. "Miss Bellamy kept the daily key, Your Grace." The name entered the corridor softly, yet it changed the air. Everett looked toward the staircase. "Then send for her. I believe she has retired. Wake her." The command came easily. Too easily. For 3 years, the house had supplied whatever he required before his need had taken full shape. Fresh ink. Corrected letters. Ledgers open to the precise page. Coffee strong enough to survive a winter morning. A carriage moved 10 minutes earlier because the weather would turn. He had mistaken anticipation for order, and order for his own authority. Mr. Vale hesitated. "Yes, Your Grace." 15 minutes later, the butler returned with Mrs. Alder, whose lined face had gone pale in the candlelight. In her hand lay a folded note and a small brass key. Everett noticed the key first. It rested against Mrs. Alder's black sleeve like an accusation. "Where is Miss Bellamy?" he asked. No one answered quickly enough. Somewhere beyond the walls, the Atlantic struck the cliffs with slow, heavy force. Mrs. Alder stepped forward. "Her room is empty, Your Grace." Everett stared at her. Empty was not a word he understood when applied to Audrey Bellamy. Useful people did not become empty spaces. Quiet people did not alter the structure of a house by leaving it. "She has gone to the village, then. Her trunk is gone. To visit someone?" His own voice sounded unfamiliar. Mrs. Alder's eyes shone, though she did not weep. "She had no one nearby, Your Grace." The butler held out the note. Everett took it because his hand remembered how to accept documents even when his mind refused their meaning. The paper was ordinary, cream-colored, folded once, her handwriting neat and restrained as always. The key fell into his palm when he opened it. For a second he thought absurdly of all the times that hand had placed papers before him, every sheet aligned squarely, every correction made with such care that he had rarely needed to ask a question. Then he read. The account matters first. The harbor lease. Mrs. Alder's medicine. The library key. Even in leaving, she had protected the house from inconvenience. At the final sentence, something in Everett went still in a way that grief had never made still. He read it once. Then again. "I smiled because I knew you would forget the wound, so I left before you could forget me entirely." No one moved. The candle near the library door bent in a draught. Everett looked at the page until the words no longer appeared written but carved. "When did she leave?" "We do not know," Mr. Vale said. "The side door by the lower passage was found unlatched. There are tracks in the snow, but the wind has softened them." "Send a carriage." "At once, Your Grace." "No." Everett closed his hand around the note. "I will go." He reached the side door without remembering the walk. The corridor where she had passed only hours before smelled faintly of beeswax and winter air. On the peg beside the door hung the spare lantern she usually carried when checking deliveries after dark. It was still there. She had left without even taking extra light. Outside, snow had covered the stone path in a thin white sheet. Everett stepped into the cold wearing only his evening coat, and the wind cut through him with the indifference of the sea. The road curved downward toward the village, already blurred by new snowfall. No figure moved upon it. No lamp answered from below. He stood there, the most powerful man for miles along the Maine coast, and understood with a sudden, humiliating clarity that authority could summon servants, carriages, signatures, and doors, but it could not summon back a woman who had finally chosen herself. Behind him, Hawthorne House glowed in every window. Before him lay the dark road and the sound of a train whistle, faint and distant, carrying across the winter fields. Everett turned sharply toward it. The last train. Boston. The knowledge arrived not from brilliance but from her own careful systems. He knew the schedule because Audrey had copied it for his aunt the week before. 30 miles away by now, perhaps more. The distance entered him like cold water. Audrey, he said. Not Miss Bellamy. Not the girl from the library. Audrey. Her name left his mouth and vanished into the snow, far too late to reach her. When he returned inside, the house seemed larger than before, each room swollen by what it lacked. In the library, the fire had burned low. The harbor lease lay waiting beside his preferred black pen, marked with a blue ribbon. He sat at the desk and saw, for the first time, that the ribbon was not blue at all but faded lavender, the same shade as the thread she used to mend the cuffs of her gray dress. Small things surrounded him. Her order. Her care. Her absence. Everett placed the brass key on the desk, pressed his fingers against the folded note, and felt the first true crack open in the locked rooms of his heart. Morning came to Hawthorne House without Audrey, and every hour after it proved how much of the mansion had been held together by hands no one had honored. At breakfast, the silver coffee service appeared 20 minutes late because the new footman did not know Everett took his coffee without sugar but with a narrow slice of lemon peel beside the cup, a habit Audrey had discovered during a winter fever and remembered without ever being asked. The post arrived unsorted. 3 letters from Boston trustees lay beneath a seed catalogue. A notice from the Harbor Commission was nearly placed in the kitchen fire because no one recognized the blue seal. Mrs. Alder moved slowly, her cough worse in the cold, and when Everett asked why she had not taken her morning medicine, the old woman looked down at her hands. Miss Bellamy kept the bottle in order, Your Grace. I do not know which dose is next. The words were plain. They struck harder than accusation. Everett sent for the physician at once, then stood in the kitchen doorway while the servants avoided his eyes. He had entered kitchens before only as a matter of inspection. Now the warmth, the flour-dusted table, the copper pots, and the uneasy silence made him feel like an intruder in his own house. Tell me what she did here, he said. No one answered. He turned to Mr. Vale. All of it. The butler's throat moved. It would be difficult to say quickly, Your Grace. Then speak slowly. So they did. Not in a rush, not with dramatic force, but in fragments, each one small enough to be undeniable. Audrey had arranged coal for the east servants' rooms after noticing ice inside the wash basins. Audrey had written to the stable boy's uncle when the boy could not manage the words. Audrey had corrected wages twice when the former steward rounded down servant pay by a few cents each week. Audrey had paid Mrs. Alder's medicine from her own pocket for 6 months because the household accounts were frozen during the winter audit. Audrey had discovered that Mr. Pritchard, the former estate manager, had hidden false entries inside the harbor ledgers, entries that would have cost Hawthorne House not merely money, but its claim to the northern pier. Everett listened without moving. Outside the kitchen windows, the sea fog pressed white against the glass. Inside him, something older than pride began to lose its shape. Where are those ledgers? He asked. Mr. Vale led him to the library, where Audrey's absence sat in her chair more visibly than any person could have done. The room had been arranged as always, curtains drawn halfway to protect the bindings, fire set but not overfed, inkstand filled, blotter fresh. On the lowest shelf behind the atlas case, Mr. Vale pressed a brass latch Everett had never noticed. A narrow drawer slid open. Inside were 5 ledgers tied with lavender ribbon, a packet of receipts, and a letter addressed in Audrey's careful hand but never sent. Everett touched the ribbon as though it might burn him. The first ledger revealed the fraud with merciless neatness. Dates. Amounts. Names. Copies of receipts. Audrey's notes in the margins, precise and calm, showed how Mr. Pritchard had nearly sold the Northern Pier rights to a shipping company in Portland through a concealed partner. If the transfer had passed, Hawthorne House would have lost control of the harbor within 3 months. Worse, the error would have appeared under Everett's own signature. The scandal would have traveled from Bar Harbor to Boston before the ink dried. Audrey had stopped it quietly. She had written to the county clerk. She had delayed the filing. She had found the original deed in a salt-damaged chest in the archive room. She had saved his name, while he had failed to remember hers. Everett sat down slowly. He opened the unsent letter. Your Grace, I have not shown you the full matter because to accuse Mr. Pritchard publicly before the winter charity appeal would weaken confidence in the hospital fund. I have arranged proof enough to remove him after the trustees depart. Until then, your reputation is safer if I remain invisible. He stopped reading. The final word blurred, not from tears, but from the violence of recognition. Invisible. He had allowed her to become the very condition that protected him. Mrs. Alder stood near the door, one hand wrapped in a shawl. She never wanted reward, Your Grace. Everett looked up. The old woman's face held fear, but also a courage borrowed from love. What did she want? He asked, though the answer already waited inside the locked place of him. Mrs. Alder's voice softened. Only to be seen before she disappeared completely. Everett rose. For the first time in years, he crossed the library not toward the desk, not toward duty, but toward the west wing corridor. The ribbon doors waited at the end, dark and patient. He took the brass key from his pocket. Not the library key. Another key, heavy and old, one he had carried since Vivian's death and never used. His hand shook once before he steadied it. Behind those doors lived the woman grief had turned into a shrine. Behind him lay the evidence of the living woman he had turned into a shadow. Everett unlocked the west wing. The doors opened with a sigh of stale air, dust, and old roses. Pale sheets covered the furniture. Vivian's portrait stood above the mantel, beautiful, distant, untouched by time. Everett looked at it for a long moment, and for the first time, he did not apologize for breathing. I remembered you so completely, he said into the cold room, that I forgot how to see anyone else. No answer came. None was needed. By noon, he had ordered a carriage to be prepared for Boston, dismissed every arrangement involving Lady Maribel Stone, and placed Audrey's ledgers in a leather case with her note folded against his heart. He could not undo the room where he had forgotten her. But he could follow the silence she left behind, and this time, he would carry her name carefully. Everett left Hawthorne House beneath a noon sky the color of pewter, with Audrey's ledgers in a leather case and her final note folded inside the breast pocket of his coat. Snow still clung to the carriage wheels as they descended the cliff road, and for the first time in years he looked back at the mansion without seeing grandeur. He saw the side door she had opened alone. He saw the library window where lamps had burned for his convenience. He saw the small dark square beneath the eastern eaves, a room colder than any chamber in the locked west wing, and shame sat beside him like a silent passenger all the way to the village station. The train to Boston ran late because of ice along the tracks near Portsmouth, and Everett, who had once considered delays personal insults, stood on the platform without complaint. Around him moved ordinary life, a farmer carrying seed catalogs, a mother fastening a scarf beneath her child's chin, a clerk stamping tickets with blue fingers. No one bowed. No one moved aside. No one cared that he was Duke Everett Hawthorne of the Maine coast. The lack of ceremony steadied him. It was perhaps the first honest room he had entered in years, though it had no walls, only snow, smoke, and iron rails. He boarded just before departure and sat by the window, the leather case on his knees. Mile after mile, the coast slipped past in broken glimpses, frozen marsh, black pine, white church steeples, fishing sheds half buried in snow. He tried to plan what he would say when he found her. Every sentence sounded too clean. Forgive me was too small. Come back was too selfish. I remember you now was a cruelty disguised as devotion. By the time the train reached Boston after dark, Everett understood that finding Audrey would not be the same as deserving to stand before her. Boston received him with hard wind and yellow lamps blurred by sleet. He took rooms at the Parker House but did not sleep. Instead, he spent the night following the faint trail Audrey had left because she was too careful to vanish foolishly, and too proud to ask anyone for rescue. At the South Station ticket office, a clerk remembered a young woman with a worn trunk who had asked about lodging near Beacon Hill but chosen something cheaper near the water. At a boarding house on Commercial Street, the landlady recalled a quiet lady who paid for 1 week in advance, wrote her name as Miss Bell, and left before dawn after asking for directions to a school connected with a widowed patroness. Soft-spoken, the landlady said, squinting at Everett over her spectacles. Looked tired enough to fall where she stood, but thanked me as if I had given her a palace. Everett gripped the brim of his hat. Did she say where she was going? A town south of the city. Fairhaven, I think. Or near it. Some little place with a church school. He thanked her with more humility than his title had taught him and returned to the station before the city had fully awakened. The journey south took him through grey fields, low stone walls, and villages where smoke rose from chimneys into the pale morning. He carried the leather case himself. No valet. No crest on the carriage. No announcement sent ahead. At Fairhaven, a hired driver took him 3 miles along a snow-packed road to a modest coastal settlement where the houses were clapboard, the fences plain, and the sea lay quieter than it did beneath hawthorn cliffs. The church stood at the edge of the village green, white-painted and spare, with a bell tower no higher than the old elms around it. Children's voices came from the adjoining schoolroom. Everett stopped outside the window before he entered. Audrey stood at the front of the room in her grey traveling dress, the same one she had worn when leaving, though now a clean white collar softened its severity. Her brown hair was pinned simply. Her face was pale, but calm. In one hand she held a primer, and with the other she guided a little girl's finger along a line of text. Do not rush the word, Audrey said gently. Let it come to you. Some things only open when treated with patience. Everett closed his eyes. The sentence found every locked door in him. When the lesson ended, the children gathered their slates and mittens, spilling into the cold with cheerful noise. Audrey remained behind, stacking books on a scarred pine table. Everett stepped into the doorway. The room smelled of chalk, coal smoke, damp wool, and winter sunlight. She looked up. Not quickly. Not with fear. Only as one looks toward a sound already expected in the heart before the ears hear it. For a moment either spoke. The distance between them was no longer measured in miles, but in every small hurt he had once failed to notice. Everett removed his hat. Miss Bellamy, he said. Her name did not leave his mouth carelessly this time. He placed it there with both shame and reverence. Audrey's fingers rested on the stack of books. Your Grace. The title was correct. The wall inside it was higher than any anger could have built. He took one step, then stopped, careful not to claim space she had not offered. May I speak with you? Audrey studied him, and he saw that absence had not made her smaller. It had returned her to herself. You may speak, she said. But I am no longer employed by your house. The words were quiet. Final. Clean. Everett bowed his head. I know. From the yard came the laughter of children throwing snow near the fence. Inside, sunlight moved across the floorboards and touched the hem of her dress. Audrey waited. Everett opened the leather case and set her ledgers on the nearest desk, not as a gift, not as proof, but as witness. I found what you saved, he said. And I found what I failed to see. Her expression did not break. That hurt him most. Those are different things, Your Grace. Yes, he said. I am beginning to understand that. Only then did Audrey look at the ledgers, and something fragile passed across her face, not hope, not forgiveness, but recognition that truth had finally followed her into daylight. Everett wanted to ask her to come home. Instead, he spoke the harder sentence. I did not come to retrieve you. Audrey's eyes returned to his. Then why did you come? The answer rose from the place her absence had opened. To learn how to become a man who would not lose you the same way twice. Audrey did not answer him at once. Outside the schoolroom window, the children's laughter drifted over the snowy yard, bright and careless, while the little church bell marked 4 o'clock with a modest sound that seemed too small for the weight of the moment. Everett stood beside the scarred pine desk with his hat in his hands and her ledgers between them. He looked less like the master of Hawthorne House than like a man who had traveled too far into the truth to return unchanged. Audrey wanted to hate him cleanly. It would have been simpler. Hatred had straight lines, while grief moved in circles, returning always to the places where tenderness had once been left unattended. She looked at the ledgers, at the familiar lavender ribbon, at the careful evidence of all the invisible work she had carried like a lantern through his dark house. "Becoming such a man is not something you can announce," she said. "No," Everett replied. "It is something I must prove where no one is applauding." That answer, quiet and unadorned, unsettled her more than any plea would have done. He did not ask her to forgive him that day. He did not ask her to return. He asked only whether the school needed coal for the remainder of the winter. Audrey almost refused out of pride, then looked toward the children's damp mittens drying near the stove and gave him the truth. Yes. By evening, coal had been ordered in the school's name, not hers. By the next week, Everett had written to Mrs. Alder confirming her medicine would continue whether or not Audrey ever crossed the Hawthorne threshold again. By the week after that, the former estate manager's fraud had been placed before the proper authorities with no attempt to hide Everett's embarrassment behind a servant's discretion. He wrote the letters himself. He signed every correction. He sent copies to Boston trustees and added a sentence that society would repeat for months. "The preservation of Hawthorne House and its charitable obligations is owed to the intelligence, restraint, and moral courage of Miss Audrey Bellamy." When Lady Maribel Stone returned his aunt's inquiry with wounded elegance, Everett replied with courtesy and finality. There would be no engagement. No announcement. No alliance purchased at the cost of another woman's dignity. Spring came slowly to the Massachusetts coast. Snow withdrew from the fences. Mud darkened the road. The sea changed from iron to blue-gray beneath softer skies. Everett visited the village every Friday, never entering the school unless Audrey permitted it. Sometimes he repaired shelves. Sometimes he carried books. Sometimes he sat near the stove after lessons and listened while she described the children's progress, saying little, learning the shape of attention. He spoke her name carefully each time, never as decoration, never as possession. Audrey noticed. She wished she did not. Healing was not a door thrown open. It was a window unlatched inch by inch after a long winter. In May, the Boston trustees held a public supper to raise funds for the coastal hospital. Audrey attended because the school's patroness insisted, wearing a plain cream dress and the small pearl comb that had belonged to her mother. She expected to stand at the edges, useful and unnoticed. Instead, when Everett rose to speak, the room quieted with the old hunger society had for spectacle. He did not perform regret. He did not turn toward Audrey as though she were a prize recovered. He looked at the trustees, the merchants, the ladies with their lifted fans, and told the truth plainly. He spoke of errors in his household, of trust misplaced, of pride mistaken for grief and grief mistaken for virtue. Then he named her. Fully. Clearly. Miss Audrey Bellamy saw what I refused to see, protected what I had neglected, and carried responsibility that should never have been placed upon her shoulders. I forgot her name before witnesses. Therefore I remember it before witnesses now, not to claim forgiveness, but to restore honor where I allowed carelessness to wound it. No one laughed. No fan rose to hide a smile. Audrey felt every eye turned toward her, but for the first time the attention did not strip her bare. It clothed her. After the supper, she found him outside on the terrace overlooking Boston Harbor. The lamps behind them glowed through tall windows. The water below held broken reflections of gold. You did not have to do that, she said. Everett kept his hands folded over the stone rail. Yes, he answered. I did. Audrey stood beside him, leaving a careful space between their sleeves. I cannot become the woman I was in your house. I would not ask you to. I will not return to the room beneath the eaves. His face changed, pain passing through it without protest. That room is no longer yours. She looked at him. What does that mean? Everett drew a small brass key from his pocket and placed it on the stone between them. It was not the library key. It was older, heavier, its handle worn smooth by years of being held and never used. The west wing is open now, he said. Not for Vivian. Not as a shrine. As part of a living house. If you ever choose to visit Hawthorne House again, you will enter by the front door, walk where you wish, and leave whenever your heart requires. No position. No obligation. No silence demanded. Audrey touched the key but did not take it. The wind from the harbor moved softly through her hair. And if I never choose it? Everett's voice was steady, though his eyes were not. Then I will still be grateful that you taught me how costly it is to be blind beside a good heart. For a long moment, Audrey watched the harbor lights tremble on the water. She thought of the attic room, the cold basin, the old pane. She thought also of the schoolchildren reading by a warmer stove, of Mrs. Alder's medicine, of a man who had stopped asking the world to protect him from memory. At last she took the key, not as surrender, but as a possibility. Months later, when she returned to Hawthorne House, it was on a bright September afternoon with the Atlantic shining below the cliffs and every window open to salt air. The servants greeted her by name. Everett stood in the entrance hall, not at the head of it like a judge, but near the door like a man who understood the privilege of being waited for. Miss Audrey Bellamy, he said softly. She smiled then, not to hide a wound, not to save him from shame, but because her name had finally become safe in his mouth. Some hearts do not break loudly. They leave, and in the silence they leave behind, the careless learn the sacred weight of being remembered.